Good morning, fellow citizens and ruminators, I should say. Welcome back to another session of Rumination with Andrew. It is indeed a wonderful privilege to be with you one more time to discuss a very important topical matter. Now, I'm sure that you are ready to be engaged in another sumptuous discussion. Now, this morning, we are going to talk about the US national debt, right? DEBT, and the fact that that debt threatens national security, threatens your liberties, all right? Your civil and political liberties, right? Because if we're not economically independent, it means that we are slaves, right? And that was a whole system of slavery that it was built on the exploitation of labor, right? And that's for that reason the slaves were free immediately, particularly before the transatlantic slave trade. We know that lots of slaves, well, not lots of slaves, but some slaves were able to buy their freedom, right? And if they had accrued enough money, if they had saved up enough money, they were able to buy their freedom and were able to live independently of the slave trade. So we ought not to think that slavery is not something that can happen again, particularly in the Western world. Of course, we know that slavery exists in other parts of the world, even to this day. Slavery has never died. Okay, and those of us living in the Western world, we often think that that is the case. But those of us, for example, of the generation that I am from, I think I'm from Generation X. Sometimes I do forget that, right? Yeah, so I am from Generation X, and that generation that comes after the baby boomers, right? 1965 to I think it's 1979. I think, right? Don't probably clip it all the way to 1981. But I'm a part of Generation X. The fact of the matter is that those of us of this generation, and even the millennials that came after from 1981 and above, right, have lived a fairly decent life. But we know that those who have come after the millennials are going to be imposed by a harsher, you know, economic life because of what we are seeing, what we are witnessing in the world, particularly in the Western world, right? Where we're seeing loads of debt being piled up, right? And being left alone. And people are not talking about that, right? They are more concerned about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But let me say this to you right now, right? Before I forget, there will be no diversity. Well, there will always be diversity, right? Because we are diverse human beings, right? And that is natural. That we cannot avoid, right? But there will be no equity and inclusion if we do not have economic equality, right? And based on what we're seeing in our world today, right, there is absolutely no economic equality. In fact, our global and local elites are working assiduously at taking, at stealing, robbing us of the little that we have, right, and fattening themselves, right? And then they foist upon us this whole ideology, political ideology of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? When they do not believe in any of those terminologies or ideologies. They don't. But they want us to believe that they care about us. And the little that we have, right, in our pockets, that we should share with the poor citizens, right? With those who are less fortunate, which we should do, all right, if we can. But what they're forcing us to do that we ought not to be forced because we're not living in a communist societies or we're not living in, well, as far as we are totalitarian society where the government dictates to us and tells us what to do, right? We have the freedom to decide whether or not we want to help. But that's not the purpose of this video. The video is to talk about the US national debt. And let me begin with some very profound statements from some of the US founding fathers. So I'm going to begin with that, and you must understand that these are not my words. right? These are the words that came from the US founding fathers, right? About the state of national debt, right? Now, Benjamin Franklin says, think what you do when you when you run in debt, rather. You give to another power over your liberty. So let me read it again. Think of what you do when you run in debt. You give to another power over your liberty. So if you have lots of debt, it means that you do not have liberty. Remember though the Bible says that the borrower, the I can't remember the quote that comes with the Bible, but it's like the borrower is lender, is lender, is slave to the lender, something of the sort, right? So the borrower is slave to the lender. I think that is the quote. It comes from Proverbs, can't remember the exact wording of that biblical quotation. Now, Thomas Jefferson says here, to preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. We must make our election between economy and liberty, or profusion and servitude. And this is coming from Thomas Jefferson. Now, notice that he's saying here that you must make your election the predominant, right, campaign policies surrounding election should always be around economy and liberty. Notice that all politicians are not talking about the economy, or if they talk about the economy, they tried to avoid speaking about the debt and how the debt will be paid, right? And if they do so, they speak in a very austere manner in which we, the citizens, right, we will have to assume that particular responsibility while they are fattening themselves and they're transferring wealth to the richest members of the society. And it's time for us to take stock and stop listening to what they're saying and look through the lies that they often are disseminating. Now, Thomas Jefferson says here again, it is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes. A principle which, if effective, which acted on, would save one half the wars of the world. Let me read it again. It is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes. A principle which, if acted on, would save one half the wars of the world. So, is Thomas Jefferson here implying that the payments of debt by successive generations would have saved us one half of the wars of the world? So can we say, therefore, that a lot of the wars that have been waged and probably are still being waged in the world depends on debt, right? That to a large extent, debt is one of the main causes. Something to think about, right? Something to think about and to reflect on, right? I leave that for you to cogitate on for the day, right? Now, Thomas Jefferson says here again, I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution. I would be willing to depend on that alone for the reduction of the administration of our government. I mean, an additional article taking from the federal government the power of borrowing, right? Because the federal government likes to borrow. That is how it comes into office and it sells its campaign, right? Strategies to people, particularly now. Now, there was another, yes, this is what I wanted to read before we move into our article from the US Today, right? Now, this is now from James Madison, right? He says that of all the enemies to public liberty, war is. Let me read that again. Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. All right, so all the wars that are being waged by America right now is going to severely impact your liberties, right? It is not Donald Trump coming to power that is the greatest threat to US democracy or US republicanism, right? Some of you like the terminology that the US is a republic, I believe that. I do think the US lost a lot of its republican status after the Civil War, because the United States had an option if they wanted to be a true republic when they started up, right? And they did not start out as a true republic, right? Because of slavery, right? Slavery prevented the United States from fulfilling all the ideals, right? All the principles outlined in the US Constitution. So slavery had that blot that stained the United States population and will ever stain it, right? That stain has never been removed. As a result of that, during the Civil War, the United States lost a lot of its US Republican status, right? And we know that the United States was made to be a republic, but, right, these honorable men, like the Thomas Jeffersons, right, and the James Madisons, they were but men too, right? And we have to understand that men of their times, and they went with the current, right? So even though men write lofty statements, right, and they make great speeches, sometimes we often do not live up to the ideals of what we say. That's why the Bible says, and joins upon us, not to put our trust in men. We can listen to what they're saying, and we can agree to points that we think are reasonable, rational, and intelligent responses and statements. But we ought not to think that a lot of times they live up to these ideals. And unfortunately, slavery was one of the erroneous, what should I say now, the erroneous characteristics of these founding fathers, US founding fathers, right? They could have had the courage more, just they have had a little bit more courage to have stood up to the system. They could have decided to end it, right? After the War of American Independence, but they didn't, for whatever reason. There were many reasons, which we shall not get into now. But they're talking about here that war is James Madison, that is, the most to be dreaded in terms of liberty and the fact that that can be a serious threat to civil liberties in the United States. And I don't think United States citizens understand that. They think that the amenities that they have there will always exist, right? It will not always exist, because the United States is not any country different from any other nation that came before it, or any empire that came before it. You have to take stock, and one day destruction awaits it. Now, war is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies, debts, and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. So what I've been talking about, the oligarchies, right? The oligarchs in these countries, particularly here in the United States, through the military-industrial complex, that is what is happening. During the coronavirus pandemic, that was what happened, that most of the wealth went into the hands of the few. And when that happens, we understand that our liberties, right, are in danger. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. The United States has been waging war, perpetual wars, since 9/11, right? With no sort of ending in sight, right? So we need to take stock here to know that Donald Trump is not the main threat, right? Is not the most serious threat to US democracy. But wars are, and wars bring debt, right? They augment the national debt. Debt causes the government to raise taxes, right? And the more taxes are raised, the more money will be siphoned from the middle and lower classes into the hands of the few. When that money goes into the hands of the few, which are the oligarchs, then the oligarchs will control you, right? And have the power to enslave you, right? And don't think you're living in the civilized world, because we know that we're not living in a civilized world, right? When we see people are being maimed and battered, and the genocide we see in the Gaza area, being perpetrated by so-called civilized nations, right? So if you think you're living in a civilized world, you need to wake up and smell the coffee, because you are not. With all of this tie and jacket and running around in nice cars, you think that's what civilization is all about? It's the mind, right? And these people don't have a decent mindset, right? Their agenda, their goal is that of control by whatever means necessary. And I hope you understand that. I don't think many of you do. But let's go into the article. Let's get into the weeds of our discussion this morning. And I saw this article yesterday in the US Today, right? That's the USA Today, sorry. And it says that record high national debt is fiscal time bomb for US Congress must diffuse it, right? So it's for US, and it says Congress must diffuse it, sorry. So we have a founding fathers' fear has come true. Federal debt burden now is the greatest threat to the US economy, national security, and social stability, right? And this was written by David M. Walker and Mark J. Higgins, right? And they're opinion contributors to the USA Today's Today newspaper. Now, we can see here the usdebtclock.org. So they went on this, and the debt is sticking. Total US debt has more than doubled since 2013 and risen by nearly 3 trillion just since June 2023, when the debt ceiling was suspended. 3 trillion. Wow. This is incredible. Now, this is a man, Joe Biden, that was going to save democracy. Have you forgotten that this was the man, this was the gentleman, right, that was touted a lot in the media during the 2020 US general elections, right? He was the guy that was touted to be the one to save US democracy. And many of you believed, right, because you don't understand the important ingredients, right, of democracy, right? You don't understand what democracy is all about. You think it's just a name, right? And it's a religion, and it will just be there like God, right? Nobody can challenge it. But I can tell you that it is not. Now, in the late 1780s, the finances of the United States were in disarray. Revolutionary War debts incurred by the Continental Congress and former colonies were defaulting, and the democratic experiment in the New World was on the brink of failure. But the nation caught a break when President George Washington appointed Alexander Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasury. In 1790 and 1791, Hamilton persuaded a reluctant Congress to establish the nation's first central bank and consolidate all outstanding state and federal debt. The federal debt burden after this action was just about 30% of the gross domestic product. A few years later, President Washington reinforced in his farewell address the need to avoid excessive debt, right? Over the next 175 years, politicians across the political spectrum largely adhered to Hamiltonian principles to preserve the integrity of the public credit. The most important principle was that debt should be issued primarily to address emergencies, especially those involved in foreign wars, and that debt burdens should be reduced during times of peace. And we know that that's not the case. Oftentimes, when there are times of peace, we see where the debt is also increasing because the powers that be are preparing us, the citizens, right, to be the people for wars, right, unending wars, right? So in times of peace, they're there, plotting and planning, right, for us to enter wars, which will definitely cost a lot of money. Americans have they have come to view wars as something that are inevitable, right? And it's almost like they're watching a Hollywood film, and you say, yes, beat him, right? Because of the violence that we see in Hollywood and in the movie theater. So right now, wars are something that are just common. It's just a natural thing to do, to go and kill people, right? Because that's what you see on your movies, right? And you've accepted that, and they have brainwashed you into believing that sitting before a dead, what do you call it now, screen, right? Watching people killing other people is something normal. And we have become accustomed to that. And our minds are so brainwashed that we do not value human lives anymore, right? So when we see the same thing on our screens, but in this case, it's real people die. It doesn't matter, right? Once I can go to Walmart and I can purchase my things, I can drive my nice car, I can live comfortably in my apartment. For now, right, it does not matter until it gets to me. And that is going to happen one day. This discipline enabled America to establish and maintain its excellent credit record, which provided ample lending capacity during periodic crises. As Hamilton predicted, the ability of the nation to borrow proved critical during the War of 1812, the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. After the first three wars, the United States restored fiscal discipline, had surpluses in many years, and reduced the debt burden. After World War II, fiscal discipline was temporarily restored, and debt GDP was reduced by growing the economy much faster than the debt, even through the federal government, though the federal government continued to run budget deficits during most years. What she did not say is that after World War II, and the United States had definitely, emerged as the preeminent power of the world, right? Even though you have a Soviet Union as a major contender, but the Soviet Union was not really any threat to the United States because the United States had accumulated so much power, right? The United States made it a threat because it wanted it to die, right? The United States didn't want the countries of the world to have any other option but their option, whether it be in the social realm or economic or political realm, right? Didn't want any other major competitor. It wanted full spectrum dominance. And from that time, it had carved out a plan, right, for full spectrum dominance, right, where it controls every sphere of the globe, right? And that is its quest, right? And we must understand that. Now, the national debt is now 123% of the gross domestic product. Now, when you say this to American citizens, it doesn't mean anything to them. But, let me wake you up, right? The United States, through the IMF and the World Bank, goes to countries, right, like Jamaica, Barbados, right, and among other countries, in Latin America and the Caribbean and the world at large. And if their gross domestic product is above, 130, say they want them to reduce it, even when it stands at 120 in the 120s of the gross domestic product. They impose austere, right, debt reduction plans on these people, where they can't pay their healthcare bills, their bill for education, they can't build their infrastructure. And then you go to these countries and you claim, oh, they don't have any toilet paper in their hospitals because of what the IMF is doing, what the International Monetary Fund, let me call her out, is doing, right? And the World Bank, the austere policies that they have imposed on these countries, right, do not allow them to have basic amenities such as toilet paper, right? Right? And then you blame the government, the local government or the national government, I should say, for not having these basic things, right? Because of those austere conditionalities, right? We call them structural adjustment programs, right? And can you imagine if these structural adjustment programs were to be imposed on US citizens? What's going to happen to you? Lots of things that you have taken for granted, you are going to realize, you are going to eventually wake up to the nightmare that many of these people in the so-called third world, right, is suffering, right? And many of you are going to have heart attack when you see that with some basic amenities, things that you take for granted, right, will be denied. You will not be able to access these things, right? Water is going to be very expensive, right? Accessing healthcare, if you think it's expensive now, is going to be double, triple more expensive, right? Education, all of these things will be priced outside of the market. And this disaster is coming if the national debt continues to be augmented. You've got to take stock, US citizens. You've got to understand that you're not living in this utopian paradise as you think you are, right? And, it's not only US citizens also, you have those people who have, emigrated from other countries who should be going to the US and educating the citizens of the United States about what happened. And these policies are US policies, of the IMF and the World Bank. They are US foreign policies. And all these policies will eventually go back to the United States. And US citizens will have to face the tune of the music, right? And that music is not necessarily wonderful music, right? You are going to be surprised what your government does outside of the US and how it treats people, right? And how it robs them of basic amenities and basic life. It's not because the country is poor, as they're telling you the country is poor, and and I'm not saying you don't have poor countries, but lots of the countries that they're saying are poor could have lived better if they didn't have these structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF and the World Bank. They could be better if the US allows it. I'm not saying now that we're going to have corruption, local corruption, but no government really wants its citizens to suffer beyond reproach. And perhaps they do, some of them do, but we know that many of these countries, they don't have wars and waging wars as the US is waging wars. So they perhaps would want, at least some basic amenities for their people. I'm just saying, right? Just speculating. Maybe they would not. Now, since then, the Hamiltonian principle has been decisively abandoned, and the federal government now routinely runs large deficits, resulting in ever-increasing debt burdens. This behavior is projected to worsen in the future, right? And very important that we understand it's going to worsen, right? Because the wars continue, and we talk about full spectrum dominance. The war in Israel and the Palestine there, the Gaza, right, is really not about the Palestinians and the Gazans and the Israelis, right, even though they are enmeshed in that war, but they're being used as proxies, right, because the United States' main quest is to control that region, right, the region of Eurasia, and they will have to move into those areas to be able to control not only the region, but the resources that are in that region. And you've got to understand it. We spend too much time talking about Palestine and Israelis, and we should include them because people are dying and we have to, but we have to look at the bigger picture. And in the media and among many of us, when we speak, we have not yet got that point, right? And those of you who have not read Chalmers Johnson's book, right? One of the most fascinating, well, he wrote 3 books, well, 4 books that are on the US empire, right? And I have read them all. And you should read them too, if you want to be educated about what is happening. Now, Chalmers Johnson was somebody who worked for the CIA, and he was a professor at US Berkeley, University of California. So he is no lightweight, right? A brilliant mind and one who puts things into proper perspective, right? And is not, tethered to any particular political belief or ideology, as many of our intellectuals are, right? He writes lucidly, clearly, and precisely. And you need to read his books so that you can understand exactly what is happening in the political realm as far as the US is concerned, right? I have read other books on the US empire, but his book stands as one. It stands out. It is one of the best, if not the best, on US empire. And the fact that he has converged it into just a few chapters. He's not using a lot of words, right? He's so precise with his words that you see, wow, that wow factor having read his book. There's so much information compact in one chapter that sometimes I have to read one chapter several times to really digest all that he is trying to articulate. Not because he's not presenting the information with clarity, it's because it's just a lot of information that he's throwing at you, and you need to learn. Many of us went through school and would not have learned a lot that he has included in his book, or in his books, I should say, right? So go online, Google, and look at Chalmers Johnson, back his books. He's now deceased. He's not going to be, earning that money now, but you need to take advantage of his scholarship and his intellectual what precepts, right? Very important that you understand that. Now, why does the United States continue to behave so irresponsibly? The question is posed. One reason is that US politicians routinely avoid spending cuts and tax increases because they may threaten their re-election prospects. And this is what you need to know. It's all about electioneering, right? And playing politics with you, US citizens, right? And they can play the politics because you're so distracted, right? You're doing so many things, so, as you would like to say, so much is going on, right? A lot is going on, right? But if you do not pay attention, then you are going to be transformed into a slave. And I don't care what your skin color is. Now, another is that as the issuer of the world's dominant reserve currency, the United States can run fiscal deficits as long as surplus countries such as China and Saudi Arabia continue to purchase US treasuries. In fact, proponents of the flawed and failed modern monetary theory implicitly argue that the dollar's reserve currency status is permanent, which allows deficit spending to continue indefinitely. That is what they're suggesting. And this is the sort of utopian world that they live in. This is delusional at best, right? And we've got to take stock. Now, advocates of this theory naively assume that the US dollar will serve as a dominant reserve currency permanently. They conveniently ignore the past fate of the British pound sterling and the Dutch guilder, right? We don't often read our history and learn the lessons from our painful history. We tend to focus more on the glory, right, of the British Empire, but we have not learned from her painful lessons, right? When are we going to grow up as a people, as a race, as the human race, right? We still behave like children as far as mental development is concerned, right? It's very difficult to have an intellectual, a serious intellectual conversation with a lot of people around. Extremely difficult because the focus is so narrow, right? People don't read. And if they do read, they don't read things that will help them to delve deeper into serious matters, right? People want entertainment and they want to hear what makes them feel entertained, right? Now, Congress must defuse America's fiscal time bomb. It's a bomb that is about to be denotated, right? An economic bomb. All right. So I'm not here. Don't say no, I'm going to say it's a bomb in terms of the bomb you up, right? It's a metaphor being used in an economic bomb, right? That will eventually detonate in terms of everything will implode and things will collapse, a financial collapse. And we saw that partially in 2008. It will collapse fully eventually. The system is going to come down, right? The walls are going to come down, right? The economic walls will collapse eventually. A debt crisis is not imminent in 2024, but one will occur in the future if the nation's addiction to deficits and debt persists. The greatest risk is one that Alexander Hamilton feared most. One day, the United States could face a threat to its very existence, perhaps in the form of a foreign war, and Americans will lack the debt capacity to fund an adequate response. Yeah, so what happens when the real wars comes? Because a lot of the wars that are being waged right now by the US are phony wars. But what happens if a real war should come? Right? And this is what, our world is so inundated with lies that sometimes we don't know when the real thing will eventually surface, right? And that is the problem we're having in our world today, right? We do not know how to distinguish between truth and error, right? Between truth and falsehood, right? And a lot of what we're seeing, and I keep on saying that to many people who tell me that they see this and they see that, or they hear this and they hear that. A lot of what you're seeing and hearing and feeling and touching, the senses are telling you, are not true, right? And that is why we have to get back into our spiritual discernment to be able to discern and to ask God to help us discern what is truth, particularly as we're living in a technological era where people can present all these images that are false but appear to be true, right? We're living in dangerous times, right? And not even the most discerning of individuals, right, is, should I say, immune to the delusion that, or all the delusions that stand out in the world that can deceive you as a populace, right? So we need to now arm ourselves with truth, read voraciously and as widely as possible. Stop going to the movie theaters. They're not helping you to develop your mind, right? They're just lowering your IQ. Form groups with your children, right? And begin to speak about important matters, right? All of these phone conversations, right? Sometimes they have nothing. All you do is gossip and talk nonsense, right? We need, all of us this year, need to find and ways in which we can have book clubs, right? And begin to read and to challenge our minds, right? To feed our minds on wholesome intellectual food and knowledge. Thank you so much for joining. I look forward to seeing you in the next chat.